Quick little PSA before we get into the video, but something you guys have been asking for from day one of Pure has finally happened, where I am so excited to announce that we now offer free shipping to 12 different countries. Where if you've been looking to try a pair of Pure Grip socks, sleeves, or any of our other products, but the cost of shipping has been holding you back, which I totally understand, you can now get free shipping at puregripsocks.com. After 2 years of success, partially due to nostalgia and partially due to the fact that the Pred 24 and 25 were both overall really solid football boots, we now have what is the first major redesign to what is now the modern interpretation of an Adidas Predator. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Adidas Predator 26 Elite FT, a football boot that is very clearly still playing the nostalgia card from a visual standpoint, but in comparison to the Pred 25 that it replaces, it changes almost every single element, except for the price tag. That remains at $280. Where I think a lot of the excitement around the return of the fold-over tongue and this classic Predator aesthetic was based around the fact that the boots were just different from everything else. Obviously, they were a far cry from the 90s and 2000s classic Predator models that we had back in the day, but if you wanted a modern interpretation of that concept, the Pred 24 and the Pred 25 did a pretty good job of that. So for Pred 26, my expectation at least would be that Adidas would lean even further into that modern Predator concept, taking all the elements that we already had, but making them that much more aggressive. In some ways, they've done that, but in other ways, I'd actually make the argument that this trends less in a Predator direction and more in the way of the F50 series, which is probably not what a lot of people want to hear. In other words, is the Pred 26 a new and improved variation of what they replace, or is it Adidas taking the Predator series in a completely different direction? We're going to discuss the good, the bad, what's changed from the previous model, how they fit and feel on feet, and of course, ultimately conclude whether or not these are worth $280, especially if the expectation is that modern Predator feel. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, watch the entire review, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the link down below. And as always, if you guys enjoy the content, don't forget to drop a like on the video, and if you appreciate the unsponsored, unsugar-coated, brutally honest opinions on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots as we head into 2026. Where first things first, we have to start with the upper because it's by far the biggest change coming from Pred 24 and 25, where with those football boots, especially when they brought back the fold-over tongue, which is an aesthetic that more or less lines up with the kangaroo leather days of the Adidas Predator series, obviously a lot of fans of the series were upset that the modern Preds weren't natural leather. Not that we didn't get some in limited quantities along the way, of which I would argue were actually the best versions, but as a compromise, they gave us Hybrid Touch 2.0 to give that leather-like feel. Did it truly feel like leather? No, not necessarily, but it was a reasonable enough compromise. With the Pred 26, Adidas have completely ditched that concept altogether, opting for a material called Nano Strike Plus, which as you can see by the finish peeking through the surface here, it's a mesh-based textile synthetic that, I guess for lack of a better word, just feels thin and plasticky, which of course isn't necessarily a bad thing in the context of, say, a speed boot. This actually reminds me a lot of the synthetic upper you'd find on the F50 Elite. However, for a Predator model, especially when we already have an F50, does it make that much sense to make the Predator just as thin with no padding whatsoever? In my opinion, not really, but that's the direction Adidas have decided to go into. Of course, what does make this different from the F50 is going to be the rubber striking elements, which you can see here scattered across the striking area of the foot, the midfoot, and even a little bit across the top of the toes in white. However, it's not until you look really, really closely that you can see which of them are actual rubber and which of them are just micro texture. With the rubber ones being extremely thin, they're made from the same SL rubber that we've seen on the Predator series for a long time now, and they feature these tiny little nubs, basically giving it a micro texture within the rubber itself that softens the grip on the surface of the element. A design that immediately made me think of the back of my toothbrush. I wish I was joking. Where from a functionality standpoint, there's definitely additional grip on the ball to be had from this main area in rubber on the upper itself. The area through the midfoot is just micro texture within the white graphic, and you can also see kind of along the bottom of the forefoot and toe box area, you have some micro texture as well that gives the surface of the upper a little bit of grittiness, not necessarily to the point where it's sticky, but it does provide some level of additional grip rather than just leaving the upper completely smooth. But because of how thin the rubber elements are and because of that micro texturing on the surface, it doesn't have that same bite on the ball either when dribbling, passing, or shooting that you got not just from Pred 24 and 25, but basically in comparison to all past rubber striking elements on Predator models, period. Where don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that it's not a noticeable feature. You definitely can feel the grip, but because the elements have been slimmed down so significantly, it loses that little bit of kind of oomph, I guess, that you got when striking through a ball that I think a lot of people expect from a Predator model, new or old. This, for the most part, like I said, really feels like a thinner F50 textile upper with some additional grip, the focal point, of course, being the main striking area on the foot, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does really feel like a watered down variation of what we had before. Where again, if you take away a lot of the grip and also take away the little bit of padding that you got from that Hybrid Touch 2.0 upper, this Nano Strike Plus material is not what I would describe as soft in any way, shape, or form. And the reason for that is because it has no padding. Of course, as you wear them in, it becomes more pliable like any thin synthetic would do. And from a structure standpoint, it does a really good job with the laces tied tight of holding your foot in place and actually providing some really solid lateral stability. If anything, these have a little bit more of a speed boot-esque feel in terms of lockdown through the forefoot and midfoot than what we had from the previous generation. But it also means that the touch on the ball is relatively thin, where I think if you're buying a Predator model, the expectation is not that you're going to have a speed boot barefoot feel, but that is more or less what's on offer here from the Predator, except if you buy the FT version with the fold over tongue, you're now getting this giant piece of padded material with some micro texture on the surface, held down by an elastic strap that is now the only cushioned part on the entire upper. Where don't get me wrong, it looks really cool, and that's the main reason why most people are going to go for the fold over tongue variation, but I have to say the transition from a super thin upper to a lot of extra padding and bulk across the top of the foot does feel a little bit more awkward than it did on the previous generations, where in general, the tongue is ultimately just for looks. This offers no performance benefit other than covering up your laces. But if you're adding a ton of extra material to do so, then is it really benefiting anything? I would personally argue no. I will say though, that the tongue, like I said, is just more noticeable on the ball with the Pred 26 due to the contrast of how thin this Nano Strike upper is. Moving across the top of the foot, the change is minimal. Like I mentioned, the surface of the fold over tongue is kind of a mesh-based textile with some micro texturing that ultimately doesn't do much in the way of anything. You of course get that elastic strap to hold it down, which is also more or less the same as the previous model. And the underside of the tongue and basically main body of the tongue that runs across the top of the foot is this really soft kind of padded microfiber material, easily the softest element on the entire upper. The lacing system is still pretty well exactly the same, running slightly off-centered towards the outside. It does run nice and deep and allows for great overall adjustability. And if you loosen the laces, something that I do appreciate is that they actually made the wings on the tongue towards the top just a little bit wider. So if you did have a pair of Pred 24s or 25s and you found that with the laces tied tight, you had a little bit of exposure along the side because the tongue wasn't wide enough, this does a good job of covering covering that space and also just helps the tongue from sliding from side to side, which really wasn't an issue with this new Pred 26. What hasn't changed though, or at least hasn't changed enough, is the heel area of the Pred 26, which as you can see is still a low cut design with a little bit of an extension tail. Your structure is coming mostly from an external heel counter, which is new. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Most of the structure up top is pretty much non-existent. It's just from the layers of material overlapping, and you have kind of that mock collar with that knit material exposed along the sides. Looking towards the inside of the heel liner, you'll find that it's lined in this soft kind of microfiber material, red in color on this particular colorway, and you have that targeted foam kind of wrapping around the upper half of the heel liner with minimal extra padding down low. If we compare this to the Pred 25 that it replaces, you can obviously see that the two designs are almost identical. And then if you look at the heel liner itself, they maybe have added a little bit of extra padding to this new model. You can see there isn't that space between the two cushions directly at the back of the Achilles tendon anymore. But in general, I don't think that these changes are meaningful enough to actually change the fit, feel, or experience of this heel design. In other words, if you had a Pred 24 or Pred 25 and did not like this heel, you're probably still not gonna like it very much on the 26. Where personally, I've never had a huge issue with this design, I will say it's far from my favorite, and out of all the top end models on offer from Adidas, this is by far their worst heel design and construction by a long shot. So if there was one area where I think they could have done some huge improvement, it's at the heel. And especially when you consider that with this fold over tongue, the opening of the football boot does kind of get pretty big compared to a normal construction, especially with a one-piece upper. Heel lockdown is something that you really need as much of as possible. Where I don't want to go as far as to say that this is a bad design for absolutely everybody, because I don't think that's the case. I've worn it myself, had no issues with discomfort. The lockdown was okay, and in general, it's passable. But it is one of those heel liners that when you get the chance to try them on, it's entirely possible that depending on preference and the specific shape of your heel, that it might just not feel good for you. And then as far as the insole is concerned, it's fully removable on the top end model that I have here. It features a soft kind of microfiber liner on the surface, so nothing really new there. But you will see that the foam package is a little bit different, featuring this new design that kind of mimics the power spine graphic that you have there on the bottom of the sole plate. But all in all, it's the same type of foam, just a little bit thicker this time around, which is actually quite nice to see. Is it the best insole in a football boot? Absolutely not, but I would say it's a slight improvement. Moving to the base, you'll find brand new sole plate and stud pattern tooling, featuring their new strike frame construction with a power spine reinforcement and a new FG layout, where in all honesty, the plastic for the sole plate is more or less the same as the previous model. The flex in the forefoot pretty well identical as well. I'd make the argument that it feels slightly higher quality in the sense that it's a little bit more structured in a way that feels solid without being bulky, which I think is very suitable for a Predator model. And then you are going to find also their power spine system, which they're claiming is going to increase the power of your shot. All it really is a stiffener bar running through the midfoot and heel that of course reinforces that part of the sole plate. From what I can tell, it's really not any stiffer or more flexible than the outgoing Predator sole plate. It feels pretty similar in regards to stiffness through the midfoot. At least that was my experience. And in terms of increased shot power, I really don't think it does anything whatsoever. This also does include an external heel counter that now has this extra insert piece that I think is more for the sake of aesthetic and changing it up in different colorways more than anything related to performance. I do think it looks quite cool though. And then as far as the FG stud pattern is concerned, they've arguably gone and made it a little bit more aggressive and have actually separated more so from the F50 than it's been in the past, where, don't get me wrong, it's still that classic Adidas layout, 4 studs under the heel, 6 studs on the edges of the forefoot with 1 support stud in the middle, but the studs now have a little bit of kind of like this half circle with a bladed edge shaping to it, which is designed to give you that kind of best of both worlds feel in terms of that freedom to twist and pivot, but also provide more bite when pushing off. I would say it feels like a slightly more aggressive variation of what we had on the previous Predator, which I think for the vast majority of people is an improvement. And while I don't think that this whole setup really feels that different than what we had before, overall, I do like it better. In other words, it's good, but definitely nothing groundbreaking, and certainly not something that's going to make your shot more powerful. And then there's the weight, where I don't think most people buying the Predator with the fold-over tongue are too concerned about a few extra grams, but at the same time, Adidas have made it a priority to make this boot as light as it possibly can be. So, for the sake of science and comparison, we'll compare the new Pred 26 to the old Pred 25 and see what the difference in weight actually is, both in the same size 9.5 US. We'll start off with the Pred 25, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.55 ounces, the equivalent of 214 grams. We'll change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the new Pred 26, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.3 ounces, the equivalent of 206 grams. In other words, Adidas have managed to shave off 8 grams with the new Pred 26, which under normal circumstances would actually be pretty impressive given the similarity between these two designs. But when you factor in that they just made the upper twice as thin on this new model, it's not quite as impressive. Nonetheless, despite having that classic Predator aesthetic, these are actually very lightweight football boots. Again, trending more in that F50 direction. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, if you're coming from the Pred 24 or 25, when you put these on for the first time, you're either going to immediately love the way that they feel or the exact opposite. And that is because this Nano Strike Plus upper is just completely different. It's thinner, it's more structured, and dare I say, it's on the stiffer side. And it also really doesn't have any padding or softness to it whatsoever. So if you're expecting that cushion sensation against your foot, you are going to be sorely disappointed with this new upper material. I will say, and this is where Adidas does deserve some credit, it's probably the most comfortable stiff upper football boot that I've ever tried, in the sense that, yes, would I like it to be a softer material? Absolutely, but because of the modifications that they've made to the shaping and just the way that the upper wraps your foot in general, the boots as a whole are not uncomfortable. I had no issues with the break-in, and yes, it does become more pliable as you wear the boots in, but like I said, soft is not a word I would use to describe this upper material. It's raw, it's thin, and it definitely provides what can only be described as more of a barefoot feel, with of course some extra grip by way of the slim rubber elements and the micro texture scattered around the upper. When it comes to width and sizing, these definitely share a lot in common with the Pred 25, particularly through the midfoot and heel, where I would say things are mostly the same. It's not until you get into the forefoot and toe box area where the volume, width, and general roundness of the shaping has been increased a little bit, to the point where it's just not as crampy as the Pred 24 and 25 were, where I always felt the toe box was a little bit too pointed. This definitely solves that problem, and for me personally, even with the stiffer upper that these have, for that reason alone, I just find these a little bit more comfortable than the previous generation Predators. That is not to say that everyone's going to have that same experience, because if you don't like the feeling of a stiffer upper, then these probably are not going to be for you. And it's also for that reason, because of how much structure this Nano Strike Plus material has, if you have really wide feet, these probably are not going to be a great option, because yes, it does become more pliable as you break them in, but it's not going to stretch much, and it certainly doesn't have any softness that is typically the more forgiving feel that you need if you have a wider foot type. So for wide feet, I would steer pretty clear of this particular model. Having said that though, they should work well for most foot types, and if you fit okay in previous generation Predators, you should be fine in this new Pred 26. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So just like the Pred 25 that it replaces, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. No changes to the sizing whatsoever. So in conclusion, is the Predator 26 Elite FT an improvement over the model it replaces? If you had the old Preds, really like them, but wish they had more speed boot elements to them, then absolutely the Pred 26 is going to be exactly what you're looking for. But if you have the old Preds, really like what they have on offer, and we're hoping for a more extreme take on that concept, a little bit more padding, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more grip. If that is your expectation, then unfortunately, the Pred 26 might be a bit disappointing. It's thinner, it's stiffer, it offers less grip on the ball than any Predator model that has had rubber striking elements, but at the same time also manages to be, at least for me, a little bit more comfortable because of the modifications to the shaping. Not that it's completely abandoned the concept introduced with Pred 24 and Pred 25, but in a lot of ways, and as many of you have commented in your first impressions of this new Pred 26, it really does feel in a lot of ways like an F50 with a tongue. Not what I personally would have wanted, but certainly not a bad pair of football boots.